Hey, I'm Bacon. So, what is art and do role playing games qualify? I'm no Ongo Goblogian, but I have at one time in my life been an aspiring artist. And out of that grew criteria for art um, to qualify what art is. And there's a story behind the criteria. Maybe I'll end up telling it. I don't know. I'll try to be short and sweet, but so the four criteria that I have are: number one, it must evoke an emotional response. That's pretty reasonable. I would say that most definitions of art or most criteria of art require that it provokes some sort of emotional response. The second one is it must display excellence in craft. The third one is it must serve no utilitarian purpose. And the fourth is that it must not contain a win-lose condition. So the first one is easy, must evoke an emotional response. I think that's, like I said earlier, pretty standard. The second one starts to get a little bit hairier, and I receive a little bit of pushback on that one typically when I enter into discussions about art. So with regard to excellence in craft, like, where do crayon drawings of children fall into that? The big one that people seem to really dislike is number three, which it must serve no utilitarian purpose. It's a little bit more nuanced than that short little statement suggests. So there can be art items included in utilitarian items. For example, let's say a carpenter makes a chair, a wooden chair. Of course, it'll be wood, they're a carpenter. And they decide to include a whole bunch of filigree to bracket the joists, and they carve ornate feet, and they carve an ornate back. The chair as an item in and of itself, I would not call an art item because it's utilitarian. However, there is artistry that went into it, and there is art that is a part of the item. And so it's more nuanced than the initial reading might report. Additionally, this also allows for categories of craft to sort of move into the art qualification when they're no longer utilitarian. The best example I have of this would be like paintings in Regency London. So you would paint a portrait of a king or a queen because there was no other option. But now, because there's photography, painting is no longer really utilitarian. Painting is usually done specifically to create art. And so there's a motion that can take place for a specific type of craft to qualify as art under the third criteria. And then the fourth one is it must not contain a win-lose condition. When I developed these criteria, two of them, so the second one must display excellence in craft, and the fourth one were to exclude specific things. So the second one was actually, when I say the second one, I mean must display excellence in craft. That one was specifically designed, and I created that one first. So it was the very first one I came up with. Because when I was in high school in about 10th grade, I was in an art class and we were learning about artists and controversial art, I think, was the topic we were discussing. And so Piss Christ came up. Andres Serrano's Piss Christ came up. And it wasn't the fact that a crucifix was in urine and taken a picture of that bothered me. It wasn't the messaging that bothered me. What bothered me is that it was such a mundane exercise to take a prefabricated item and just take a picture of it in a situation. That can be a message for sure, but I didn't like it as art. I didn't like the idea of just like taking a vacuum cleaner and sticking it behind an acrylic case and calling it art. And so that's where the excellence in craft criteria came from. Where the win-lose condition came from was video games. I don't think that video games are art. Much like the carpenter's chair example, I think that there is artistry involved in creating them, but as a whole, I don't think that they really qualify as art, and now they don't under my criteria. Petty, maybe, but that's where I am. Also, There's an argument that can be made that finishing a game, so completing a game, especially one that's telling you a story, isn't necessarily a win-lose condition. It's like getting to the end of a book. You're not winning the book for completing the book. You're just completing the story. And so an argument can be made about that for video games. One that comes to my mind is Valiant Hearts. It's a side-scrolling World War I game, absolutely incredible. Very basic, very rudimentary as far as video games go, but the story it tells is just magnificent, if you like war stories, which I do. So does role-playing... I mean, obviously there's a little bit more discussion to be had here, but this, again, like the first video, it's me just kind of vomiting my ideas out onto the internet, just to get them out. So I do plan on having more conversations specifically about this topic, because I think that the broad application to movies and to literature, and there's different qualifications you can make, especially with regard to the excellence in craft. Like, just because someone takes a terribly written story and executes it poorly, but films it, doesn't make it art, right? And so there are some conversations that can be had around this, but this is me just kind of getting it out there and then relating it back to role-playing games. So does role-playing meet this criteria? So the first one, does it evoke an emotional response? The answer is yes, but here's the thing. Real role-playing is boring to watch. So the emotional impact it has is going to be on the role player themselves, or maybe the group, right? The thing is that the emotional reactions made by the other players are also role playing. So the emotions of who you became and what you experienced is for you, right? And so your actions within the game may provoke emotional reactions from the other players, but those reactions will all be based on the internal emotions of their characters, which they are genuinely experiencing, or at least they should be genuinely experiencing within the context of roleplay. So while you are provoking an emotional response, it's their emotions, and so they're the ones experiencing those emotions genuinely. And so it becomes a little weird with role-playing because there's no external observer. Like, you're the one experiencing your emotional baggage, I'll call it. You're the one that has, the application of cultural norms based on where your character came from or religions that they were brought up in. And so really you're the only one that can experience that. But I think that still qualifies under my criteria anyway, because the criteria doesn't say that it requires it doesn't require an emotional response from an external observer. It just requires an emotional response. So there are millions, hundreds of millions of words written by people that never intend to share them and never do share them. And so these things that they write are emotional to them, and rereading them still gives them that emotional response. Just because they're the ones that had written it, that doesn't disqualify it. And just because they're the only ones that experience it, that doesn't disqualify it. So I would say that under my first criteria, role-playing for sure elicits that emotional response. So the second one, a little bit tougher, because it must display excellence in craft. Now, the craft that we're talking about specifically is role-playing, obviously. And so that, again, becomes a little bit difficult to identify externally. It also requires that you gauge the excellence of any given player's role-play capabilities. And I know that people really don't like doing that. There is discussion around the internet of like 1D roleplay, 2D, 3D, and 4D. And so there's this gradient of what immersion looks like. I'm not going to say what good roleplay looks like, but when you break it down like that, the quote unquote the best role playing that you're going to find is probably going to be some 3D and most 4D. But because all of the role playing is going on essentially in the minds of the players for having assumed those characters' roles, it's going to be really difficult to identify again to an outside observer. So, and this is all going back to an original point I made in my first video about role-playing being an individual experience in a group setting. It just makes it difficult for an outside observer to quantify really the first two criteria, the emotional piece and the excellence in craft piece. I think that they can be qualified. I think that they should be qualified. And I think that an astute external observer can probably drill down on it. But I would generally say it's going to be difficult to do. 3, must serve no utilitarian purpose. This is also one that is a little weird. And the reason is because, like, I guess we have to have that discussion over whether or not role-playing does serve a utilitarian purpose in assuming the role of another individual, in expressing the ideas that that individual has, in experiencing the emotions, in making the choices for that character, that it's essentially a lived experience. And is that a utilitarian end? Like, are you getting anything out of it? Is it providing you with some measure of how to be a human? And now I think that it can, but I don't necessarily think that's the goal. I don't think a goal of role-playing is to provide a utilitarian grasp on what it means to be human, right? But I also think that that argument can be competently made. So it's a little strange, right? So it's kind of yes and kind of no. Like, it kind of does serve a utilitarian purpose, but it kind of doesn't. Like, getting a different perspective through acting out a role is I think it could go both ways. I think it could go both ways without being too long-winded. And then 4, must not contain a win-lose condition. I don't think that role-playing contains a win-lose. I don't think that good role-playing contains a win-lose condition. I think, like getting to the end of a book, it's not winning or losing the book. It's just completing the book. And I think that role-playing is treated in a similar way. I think that role-playing is you complete a character or a character dies, but even if there's a goal that's been established by character motivation, reaching that goal doesn't mean that you've won. Because it's a lived experience, I'm going to relate this back to an actual life now. So I'm living my life, and I have a goal that I want to make a YouTube channel. Making the YouTube channel, and let's say getting to, I don't know, 25 subscribers, that's not a goal that means I win, right? Because there's always a next step. There's always something else to be done. There's always until I die. And when I die, that doesn't mean I lose. It's just a natural part of living. It's that's where the compilation of my experience becomes final. And I don't think that that is enough to provide a win-lose condition. I'm not collecting points as I go through life. I'm not quantifying some collection of something at the end of my life to say, oh, well, yes, I won, or no, I didn't win. Even if you are religious and you believe that you have a soul and you get to the end of your life and you either go, wherever your afterlife is, either up or down, heaven or hell, is that a win? Is that a loss? I don't necessarily think it can be viewed that way. And so I do think that under certain circumstances, if you're willing to quantify the craft in role-playing, and if you're willing to have the discussion on the utilitarian purpose in role-playing and whether or not it's large enough to weight it out of qualification, it does count. But because it's an individual experience in a group setting, you're really the only one that can determine whether or not it was art. So it's a lot of self-evaluation, but I mean, it is performative, right? And so, you know, ballet is performative, theater is performative, acting in general in film is performative. So I think that there is a level of craft, and uh, you know, at least according to my criteria, it is. Um, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of pushback on the criteria that I mentioned. I'm very happy to have those discussions. This is something that I have been kicking around and refining and re-refining for the past, like, I don't know, 25 years or something. So I'm very prepared to have these conversations. If you think I'm wrong, tell me why. Thank you very much. Take care.